everyone, let me tell you a little personal story. I first became a wrestling fan in the year 2000, I think. I don't remember it too well. I was very young, but I remember big feuds like Triple H versus The Rock. I remember huge characters like Kurt Angle and Chris Jericho. And obviously, like many of us do, once I got to school and being cool was important, I kind of fell off the old wrestling a little bit. Or, well, that's not quite accurate. I fell off publicly from wrestling around the time of the invasion angle and afterwards, as many of us did. But secretly, sneakily, over the years, I did sort of stay in touch. And that is because of the magic of the internet, capital I, where I was able to learn about wrestlers that I'd never even heard of and could barely imagine what they looked like wrestling. Men like AJ Styles, Samoa Joe, and a man who's quite important in this video called CM Punk. Now, around this sort of time, a few years after I'd fallen off, CM Punk obviously signed with WWE, but I still wasn't fully back in touch once again. I didn't really know much about him at all. That's because I wasn't watching the product actively. I was just kind of keeping up to date with it by browsing wrestling forums, which were highly populated with people that I at the time assumed were far cooler and far cleverer than me, because they would tell everybody else that their opinions were wrong about wrestling. Since then, obviously, I've realized that they were grown adults who spend far too much time talking about wrestling on the internet, which is exactly what I'm doing now today. And honestly, I never posted on these forums. I was just a little lurker because it was full of this language that I only just was beginning to understand. Things like kayfabe, work, shoot, mark, smark, all these things that I barely understood what they meant. And as the years ticked over, it stayed largely the same, and I learned a little bit more here and there. And then something happened to set the forums that I was browsing absolutely ablaze. It was the pipe bomb promo, and I decided there and then I have to watch the next pay-per-view. And that pay-per-view, I believe, is one of the greatest of all time. Money in the Bank 2011. Now, for those of you who've watched this series before, you'll know I like to break things down into 5 distinct categories. And for category number 1, let's just waste no time at all. Let's talk about the one that everybody knows about when we're talking about what makes this show so great. It's CM Punk versus John Cena, the main event. Now, famously, of course, this match was WWE's first match to earn a 5-star rating from Dave Meltzer for well over a decade. You have to go all the way back to Shawn Michaels versus Undertaker at Bad Blood in Your House. And also, it would be WWE's last match with a 5-star rating until years later with Johnny Gargano versus Andrade Cien Almas at NXT TakeOver Philadelphia. Now, of course, I know before you raid the comments, Dave Meltzer's 5-star ratings are the opinion of just one man. And how much value can you put in the opinions of just one man? But what I think it does help us see is just how good this match was and how important it was to earn such a rating at a time when basically rating WWE's matches that highly was not in vogue at all. This match is great for so many reasons, not just the action in the ring, which is superb and was one of the first matches that made people really think, hang on, is John Cena actually way better than we thought? And it might not be as slick and polished as other matches on a similar level, but what it does feel to me is very, very real in a way that maybe a Bret Hart match would feel. But there are so many other factors beyond just the moves themselves. CM Punk's hometown entrance in Chicago, Illinois is one of my favorite entrances of all time. Maybe my number 1 entrance of all time for the sheer atmosphere. There's no theatrics or fireworks or anything. He just walks to the ring. But my word, that response he gets. There's even a specific moment that I really enjoy where he's on the turnbuckle, he's already G'd up the crowd, they're all up there for him. And then we get to that moment where a wrestling entrance and a pop naturally starts to subside. But CM Punk instead goes, no, come on, cheer for me more. It feels so real. It feels like he's a boxer or a fighter or something. It feels like an actual sporting contest in the hometown of one of the combatants. There's also little character moments in the match here and there, such as, for example, the early exchanges where the crowd are chanting, "You can't wrestle," at John Cena. And then Punk very charismatically goes, "What, you're talking about me?" And then they're like, "No." And then he goes, "Oh, you mean him?" And they all go, "Yeah, we hate John Cena, we hate him so much." There's little touches as well, like John Cena having to dig deeper into his arsenal than he usually would. There's also that moment near the end, I have to mention that, where Punk hits the go to sleep and Cena collapses and crumples outside of the ring, and CM Punk's expression, his reaction to this is priceless because he knows he needs him in the ring to win the match and he can't believe it. And then there's the finish. We've all seen it a million times. Vince McMahon and Johnny Ace coming out, John Laurinaitis of course, to try and stop this from happening. Vince sends Johnny to go and ring the bell and cause a screw job. John Cena decides to be noble and he hits Johnny Ace and stops him from getting there. But it's Cena's undoing, because as soon as he gets back in the ring, he is blasted with another go to sleep. And Punk wins and he foils Del Rio's cash-in attempt and he escapes off into the night. And it's one of the most organic, real and heroic match endings I can ever think of. But it's not just the narrative of this match that makes Money in the Bank 2011 one of the greatest WWE pay-per-views of all time. Now on to point number 2, and this is going to sound just so pretentious, but don't worry, the meta-narrative. Oh yes indeed. Now, I mentioned in my intro the way that the build to this match set internet forums on fire, and the reason for that is because nothing like this had ever been done on this scale in this way. Now, apart from 1 or 2 examples, I'm not a huge fan of worked shoots in pro wrestling. To me, they always seem really cliched. They always seem like kind of silly booking. It's usually a cool heel or a group of cool heels standing in the ring and slipping in insider terms to try and pop the crowd. And it's all stuff like, brother, Mizark, blah, 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 shoot work, it's not for me. But CM Punk's pipe bomb really changed the game, because it wasn't an attempt at a bit of a sly wink and a nod to the smart fans to try and get us on side. It was a real airing of real frustrations that fans had been feeling in the decade since the Attitude Era had ended. It was totally out of nowhere as well, and crucially, it made sense both ways. It made sense out of kayfabe, it made sense in real life, because these were real frustrations that we all had with WWE's booking, the incessant pushing of Cena, the overlooking of certain internet favourites, but it also worked in character. It worked in kayfabe, and that's so important, because CM Punk's character, as well as the man himself, was a king on the independent scene, and absolutely his character, who was quite arrogant, would have a huge chip on his shoulder at being passed over in WWE. But as I've mentioned, it also has another layer of narrative. It also tells the story of, basically, it boils down to what it means to be a wrestling fan. Throughout the entire history of wrestling, the very nature of it is that we cheer for the guy that they've told us to cheer for. And that all changed in the 90s, of course, when we started cheering for whoever we wanted to, often cool heels like the NWO. And then, in the 21st century, something weird happened, where WWE, suddenly owning this monopoly of the wrestling industry, basically tried to redress the balance, and they tried to once again tell us who to cheer for, but this time through the power of things like the internet and the rebellious nature that we still had from that 90s explosion of, cool heels. We weren't going to be told what to do anymore. And the build to Money in the Bank 2011 fully embraced this and acknowledged it, and in a way embodied this entire argument as well. What it means to be a wrestling fan, what it means to be a smarky wrestling fan specifically as well. It really tapped into something that had been unacknowledged by WWE for many years, and it left me with this feeling as a teenager. Number 1, I have to watch this pay-per-view, and number 2, I really, really, really want CM Punk to win. Now, some wrestling shows are remembered as one-match cards, essentially. Shows like WrestleMania 13, primarily remembered for how excellent Austin versus Brett was. The rest of the show, WrestleMania 25, exactly the same story. The undercard, not brilliant, except for one match, Shawn Michaels versus The Undertaker. I don't think it's fair at all to put Money in the Bank 2011 into that same category. In fact, I think the undercard is one of the show's great strengths, which brings us on to point number 3, which is the undercard. Orton versus Christian for the World Heavyweight Championship is absolutely awesome. It's a feud that I've broken down in a little bit more detail in another of the videos in this series, why Christian is one of the greatest of all time, so do check that out if you haven't seen it yet. But it's a wonderful match. It's got 2 very different, very distinct characters who have an amazing chemistry in the ring, and it also has a unique dynamic to it. Christian trying to provoke Orton into getting himself DQ'd and losing the title, which ultimately he does. The 2 Money in the Bank ladder matches are absolutely superb as well. The opener, of course, is the SmackDown Money in the Bank ladder match, and it is kind of what you expect from a top-level Money in the Bank ladder match. It's absolute carnage. The most memorable and famous spot, I think, from this match is Sheamus putting Sin Cara through the ladder bridge and Sin Cara being carted off to the back, but also the ending's really compelling too, because you've got Daniel Bryan, Cody Rhodes, and Wade Barrett. Bryan, of course, chokes out Cody. That knocks him off the ladder. He's still got to deal with Barrett, and he does so with a series of elbow strikes and a big kick, and basically wins the match by being really indie about everything. I mean, he's used submissions and martial arts strikes, and that's really indie, and I think that's deliberate. It's also a little bit of a thematic signpost towards the main event, because this indie darling has won and has got one of the biggest wins of his career in WWE. Could another indie darling do exactly the same? Yeah, I mean, yes, he could. We know that already. The Raw ladder match was also great, but crucially, it was different enough to stand apart from the SmackDown ladder match. The SmackDown one's probably a little bit superior, but the Raw one doesn't try and be a clone of it. Otherwise, I think it would have suffered quite a lot. Instead, it's more about twists and turns and strategy more than it is about just all-out action. I mean, you've got everybody holding a ladder at the start, which is a very unique opening to a Money in the Bank ladder match. You've got little storyline beats like The Miz being taken away with a worked knee injury and then limping back down to the ring when everybody else is down on the canvas or down on the floor to try and steal a victory and ultimately failing in his attempt to do so. You've got it all boiling down to Rey Mysterio and Alberto Del Rio. Mysterio being heelishly unmasked when he's on the verge of winning, and ultimately that cost him the match. It's a good one. It's a shame about the winner, isn't it? It's a very, very strong undercard. Very strong indeed. It's not a perfect undercard. You know, Mark Henry Big Show, yeah, it's okay. Kelly Brie Bella, But generally, the undercard's, it's a strong one across the board. Don't worry about it too much. On now to point number 4, which is the mythology that the event has collected since it took place. In the years since it happened, Money in the Bank 2011 is kind of this revered event. It almost, looking back, feels like it didn't actually happen. It's more of like a fictional story that we've heard in the past. Maybe it's just me who thinks that. Maybe I'm going a bit crazy. Too much wrestling for me recently, over the past 5 years or so. And the reason it's reached this mythological status isn't just because of the action, it isn't just because CM Punk won, it's because of details that have emerged afterwards. Things that were going on in the background in the build-up to this event, and things that we've learned happened after the event as well. For example, we've since learned, of course, that for a while, the build was a lot more real than we thought it was. It emerged that CM Punk actually hadn't signed a new contract, and apparently only did so, according to CM Punk himself, on the day of Money in the Bank 2011. And of course, we also learned after Punk's explosive appearance on Colt Cabana's Art of Wrestling podcast that afterwards it really was as tense and as difficult as you might imagine, given the wasted potential of CM Punk once he won the big one. And all of these little details, and of course Punk's acrimonious exit from WWE in 2014, all has kind of boosted the mythology of the event even more. Yes, it was a high point of CM Punk's career and of John Cena's career, and a high point in the history of WWE pay-per-views, but at the same time, it's still remembered as a tale of wasted potential. It's got a very tragic element, and again, I think that's just reinforced the mythology of it even more. But seriously though, it could have been so much more. Kevin Nash? Are you joking? This all ended with Kevin. Okay, I've got nothing against Kev, but this was wrong place, wrong time. And finally, point number 5, why Money in the Bank 2011 is one of the greatest pay-per-views of all time. Its significance. It's a very significant event in wrestling history, not just WWE history. Very much so. And at the risk of totally contradicting my last point about it being wasted potential and everything like that, I think it did achieve a lot. It just didn't achieve a lot for CM Punk. I think it's a completely fair argument to say that without Money in the Bank 2011, Daniel Bryan would never have had that ultimate triumph, one of the best moments ever at WrestleMania 30. That was CM Punk's moment. That was a moment that he deserved and that he needed. But you can't begrudge Daniel Bryan the moment, can you? Because he deserved it every bit as much as CM Punk as well. And again, without Punk kicking the door open, I don't think someone like Daniel Bryan could have walked through. Which is crazy to say, because Daniel Bryan's one of the best wrestlers ever in the world ever. That's a weird sentence. He is. But I don't think that he could have done it if it weren't for CM Punk. But it goes even further than that. My argument's getting a little bit tenuous here, but stick with me, because I'm going to suggest that without Money in the Bank 2011, there may not have been as renewed an interest in wrestling outside of WWE. Do you see where I'm going with this? In CM Punk's pipe bomb promo in the build to the event, he name-dropped Ring of Honor and New Japan Pro Wrestling. New Japan Pro Wrestling, of course, is the home of the Bullet Club. It's where they were born, it's where they came together. And, you know, the Bullet Club led to a little promotion called AEW. And that's obviously a very, very tenuous link on the surface. You know, you might be saying, come on, Jack, he just name-dropped the promotion in the pipe bomb. That doesn't necessarily mean he was responsible for the Bullet Club. And I agree. But on the other hand, I wonder how many of us, how many wrestling fans of this generation would have learned about the world of wrestling outside of WWE were it not for the pipe bomb and everything that spiraled off because of it. Because I can say, personally, I wouldn't have. In fact, if it weren't for this event, I would never have got back into wrestling fully. I might have still kept an eye on what was going on, but I would never have become invested again. I would never have become emotionally attached to it again. And I don't think I would have ever really been a fan of it again. And if it weren't for that, I wouldn't be standing here doing this video now. I wouldn't have the great job that I do and enjoy day on day, apart from when, the others are being mean to me. And because of that, I feel like I personally owe Money in the Bank 2011 a sincere thanks. And I think quite a lot of us probably do as well. So it's a great event. Check it out if you somehow haven't seen it already, in its entirety, of course. And yeah, CM Punk for life, come on!